We went over some printing best practices earlier during the lookbook project, so we won't be repeating all of those principles, so be sure to review that if needed. However, there are some more printing considerations to go over in InDesign, and that's what we'll be reviewing in this lesson. So go ahead and go to File, Print, and of course we can adjust copies, and then either print everything or specific range, and the default is just printing pages, not spreads, because that would combine, for example, pages 2 and 3, 4 and 5 on a specific page. And usually when you're sending it to a printer, we're printing it as pages for this kind of document. But sometimes we do need to print spreads, so that's why we have that option. Now, printing master pages, one context where we would use that is when we want to print a proof and make sure the correct content is on the master pages, and we can take notes on that after we print it out. And by default, we're not going to be printing objects that are sent to be non-printing, because there should be a reason why we set it to be non-printing. However, if you do want to print a document, including everything that's on the pages, even the things that are designated as non-printing, we could check that. Now, printing blank pages sounds strange. Why would we want to print blank pages? Some longer documents, like books, occasionally have blank pages, and so the printer might require that it includes these blank pages in the output. So if that's the case, we'd want to check that. And of course, our final product, we don't want to have visible guides and baseline grids, but if you want to check the alignment of certain content, or we otherwise want those guides on the printed proof, we can check that. And as far as printing layers, we can set it to print all layers or just visible layers, but by default, we have visible and printable layers. Now, when we have multiple copies, say I printed 50 copies of this, we can tell it to collate them. If we check collate, it will print those, for example, pages 1 to 16 in a row and keep that so it could be stapled right away, for example. And if we don't have those collated, then it would be 50 copies of page 1, 50 copies of page 2, and so on. Now down here where it says setup, and on Mac it might say page setup or printer, but on PC it just says setup. We don't want to adjust settings in that dialog if they can be controlled here in InDesign. That's what this error warning says. But there are a couple things we can set in this printer dialog box. If I go to preferences, for example, and I go to print on both sides. So double-sided printing, we can set there, and we would click print and it wouldn't print it right away. It would just go back to this print menu, and then from there we got to click print to actually print it. But the settings we can set here in the print dialog, we should do here in InDesign. Now, as far as the setup goes, we went over that earlier as far as page sizes and resizing it for a proof if needed, and thumbnails for a proof. And tiling is just printing out multiple parts of a page and then attaching them together. But it's better to find a printer that can just print that page size on a large format. But if you can't access, say, for example, a poster that can be printed, if you don't have a local printer that can do that, that's one option, is to print those out as tiles and then paste them together on a poster. But I do suggest finding a printer that can print on a large format. Now, marks and bleeds, a lot of printers will not need us to put these on there. Some printers nowadays will want to put printer marks on there themselves. So just check with your printer. And under output, remember we want to set this to composite RGB if we're just printing to our inkjet printer. And make sure text as black is checked if we're setting it to composite gray. Although if you do have some text on top of a black background and it's set to white or a light color, then we don't want to set that text as black because it won't have enough contrast from the background, of course. So just check and do a test print and see how it looks. But composite RGB is the default for an inkjet printer. If we set it to composite CMYK, if we have it connected to a commercial printer or a really nice CMYK printer, then we do need to go down to color management, and instead of document RGB, sRGB, which is what we use if it's set to composite RGB, we need to set it to the actual printer setting here for the CMYK process printer. So make sure that's installed. If you're actually printing this at a commercial printer, you want that specific printer profile listed here, and then that will match up with setting that to composite CMYK there. That's only if we have a PostScript printer, commercial printer that's high-end, but most people are going to have inkjet printers, color laser printers, and for that, just keep that set to sRGB, composite RGB. And under graphics, where it says optimize subsampling, that just means it's compressing or downsampling images so they're not technically as high quality as the original. If we do proxy, that will bring down the resolution, our typical 72 ppi, or for printing DPI, and that's more for a proof. None would have no images. It would just be printing out a proof to look at the overall layout and the text of the publication, and then optimize subsampling does compress the photos, but tries to keep them high quality as much as possible. But then setting it to all would be a final print. There's no downsampling or subsampling of those photos, so there's no reduction of quality or compression. Now, fonts are grayed out right here, but if I set this, for example, to PDF, it would give us the option to include our fonts, and that's the default, and that is what we want, unless the font license does not allow us to include the font with the publication, and if that's the case, then we want to change that to another font. If we set that to none, it's not including any of the fonts, and we're assuming that the printer has the same font that we used, but they might have a font with the same name, and it just looks different than ours, so I don't suggest setting it to none. And as far as the PostScript, level 3 is the default here. I suggest keeping it on that. Level 2 would be for printers that are a bit outdated, but they should allow for level 3. And under the Advanced tab here, this is grayed out, print as bitmap, because I'm not printing to a non-PostScript printer, I'm printing to PDF here. So I'll set this to an inkjet printer, and now it's got that available. So printing as bitmap is when we are printing to a non-PostScript printer, and we can rasterize all the artwork, the graphics, when we're printing. And so that's for when we're printing documents that contain really complex objects, like shapes with complex gradients, smooth shading, and so on, because it reduces the likelihood of having errors in the printing process. Print as bitmap option will be available if the printer driver can tell the printer is non-PostScript. I do suggest printing a test print and see if the complicated graphics are printing out correctly. If they're not converting properly to the print format, then try printing it as bitmap. As far as setting the output resolution, it can be limited to the resolution of the printer driver itself. So you want to set the printer driver that's non-PostScript to have a resolution to be the same or greater than the output resolution set here. 300 dots per inch is kind of the default, but 600 dots per inch would even be more, but that may not be possible with the printer driver, so just check. If you print on an inkjet printer that's, of course, non-PostScript, and the complex graphics like gradients aren't printing out correctly, try printing as bitmap with, say, 300 dots per inch, or if we need to, we can set that to a different setting. 72 dots per inch is pretty low. It won't look as high quality printing out compared to 300 dots per inch, but test that out. So it's helpful when we need to rasterize all the artwork. And transparency flattener, of course, any transparency effects do need to be flattened. They can't be layered literally on the paper, of course. So InDesign flattens it. And this is where we tell InDesign what kind of resolution to use. So medium is the default, but if you set that to high resolution, it will just have higher quality when those designs that have transparency in them are flattened in order to be printed. And OPI, I mentioned that earlier. This is not as common, but this would be where we have placeholders basically, or proxies for high resolution images instead of having the high resolution images placed and linked from InDesign. So it would replace those proxies or those placeholders with the high resolution versions of those photos from a server. So we can ignore that for this example. So once we're ready, we'll print, and either print that to a local inkjet printer, or if you're at a commercial printer, we could print to that. I don't suggest printing to PDF. I do suggest going to File Export for PDF instead. So those are some more printing considerations. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next lesson.